Right on, writers, and welcome first-time viewers to the Books by ADRIAN author platform. This is Typewriters Podcast. Today we'll be chatting with Robert Jones. At the time of recording, we've just wrapped up Livestream Sunday for the week, and if you missed it, watch the replay. It's linked here in the downstairs section for the YouTube audience, and in the show notes if you're listening to the audio-only podcast. For those of you listening on Apple Podcasts and Spotify, make sure that, well, first of all, thank you very much for supporting the show. Subscribe to the podcast on those platforms. Leave us a 5-star review. That really helps bump the podcast up. Any and all help in that arena is greatly appreciated. YouTube folks, likewise, subscribe, hit the bell. It's the right thing to do, so just do it. And leave us a comment downstairs regarding your favorite comic book storyline or comic book movie storyline. Wow us with your comment, and you might be chosen for the comment of the week. Okay, now let's welcome our guest back into the room. Let's welcome back Mr. Robert Jones. Robert? Oh, sorry, that was me. Hi, Robert.
Hey, Adrian.
That's my fault. How are you?
Good.
So we just wrapped up Livestream Sunday. I thought it went rather well. What did you think? How did it go for you?
Yes.
Yeah,
It definitely went well.
it was fun. I like that one. It's a nice quick hour. I know that we don't always get into like the deep interview places that you could go with like a 2-hour stream, but I like to keep it kind of short and eventful and make people have, a reason to like show up and enjoy it like in the moment. You know what I mean? Like it's
I can't disagree.
a little blip, and then it's gone.
And then they have this where they can get maybe
This
a
is
little more
extra.
from the answers, a little
Yeah.
different.
A little extra. Yeah, I like to think of it as almost like the green room. After the show, you're backstage and like you turn on a little recorder and you're like, "Hey man, so how did it go for you?" Yeah, it was cool. That kind of thing. Yeah. So it's the Typewriters Podcast. This used to be the Books by Adrian podcast, and it's kind of going through a little metamorphosis for this new season of Livestream Sunday. So I just didn't want anybody to be confused. It's the same podcast. It's on the same, feed and everything. So you're not in the wrong place. It's the same thing. Robert, what else from comic books besides the sequential storytelling do you find yourself like kind of turning back to when it comes to writing? Not necessarily, I know that, for example, for me, comic book characters are, these kind of larger than life, very colorful, and in some cases even godlike beings, right? And it's always interesting to me when you pluck one of those out and just put them in like a totally ordinary world where they're the only special thing, and what does that do for the story? I like playing with that kind of stuff, and that comes from comic books, I think, for me. So what about you? Is there something that affects your writing like that from comic books?
It was definitely the characters, their personalities, their quirks, their flaws. I think back, especially, well, DC still does it, and Marvel still has a little bit of a difference in that the DC characters will be more in the adventure, but not always as much personality or problems or social life. But back in the day, we basically had the identity like Clark Kent. He was working his job, but he didn't really have a life. He was there just as a disguise for Superman, who was the main attraction. Then you go over to Marvel, and SpiderMan had this whole life as Peter Parker that he was kind of sacrificing every time he put on that mask, and he had real life problems with school and dating, and it was like, wow, this is real. This takes it to a different level. So the characters are the thing that I remember being influenced by the most.
It's interesting to me when it comes to Superman because so many people talk about whether obviously Clark Kent is sort of more the mask when he's in Metropolis. He's wearing that so people don't suspect that he's Superman. I always found it interesting that he felt the need to do that at all. When he just be Superman all the time, and I mean he can hear every cry on the planet already. He doesn't need to be in a newsroom to find out what's going on. Like, he can hear it. Like, I always found it interesting that he felt the need to play human Nobody was making him do that.
We all need a situation, and he was raised as a human, so I think he'd be very lonely just sitting in his fortress of solitude and then putting on the costume and flying down to rescue everybody. He wanted some kind of an existence, but they didn't really fully give it to him early on. And are they still fully giving it to him? They're trying so many different things that it's like throwing darts at a board and saying, here's the extreme thing we can do to Superman. Let's have him be abused, and let's have this happen to him. And all they really have to do is look at the character that they've created. I think Superman has a lot of flaws. I think Lois Lane plays into that because she always needs a rescue as a very strong woman, and he flies in there and rescues her. I think they're caught up in this whole scenario where they they have some real emotional issues, and playing on that, I think, would be a more interesting thing than anything else they could do with the character.
That's such a brilliant read. The whole idea that he didn't really get a normal life before, so now he's kind of trying to make one for himself. I was looking at it wrong. Yeah, nobody's making him do it. He wants to. He longs for it. He longs for that connection.
I think it's very human or Kryptonian to want to find the perfect group, and the perfect group doesn't exist. And what he found with Lois is this dichotomy of a very similar psychosis that they both play into.
Yeah, for sure. Some of the best live action Superman stuff that I've seen recently is in the first couple episodes of that Superman and Lois Lane show that came out recently. I don't know if it holds up further on down, but I watched the first 3 or 4 episodes, and it's pretty solid. Some solid Superman as a dad and a husband kind of stuff that I hadn't really seen before in movies or anything like that. It was refreshing.
It does take him to a different level because he has those kids questioning him. It's just not Lois who needs a rescue. It's them saying, come on, Dad, get real. And
it's not
pulling
just
him
that
off of his pedestal.
It's not just that they're questioning him. For me, it's the idea that when I became a father, my life changed forever. I changed as a person forever. There's a before and an after from that point. It's very different. And so in my mind, the same is for him. He became a father. Now everything is different for Superman. That's a whole new dimension to him that I know that they've been doing that recently in the comics. He has a kid now in the comics, but I'm not caught up on those yet. So I hadn't actually experienced that before until those first few episodes of that show. It was good for me.
Yeah, I think it was a step in the right direction.
It's what I loved about Spider-Man is that he grew up with his audience, like Harry Potter grew up with his audience. That Spider-Man grows up and goes from a high school student in some eras of comics to a college student to a married man with kids eventually in other eras of the comics. I love that they allow him to develop through so many eras. It always frustrates me when they want to go back, but I get it. It's all just jumping around anyway.
The problem I foresee with that is the same problem that TV had or any ongoing series, is once you get them married and they have kids, then they're not as strong or available for other stories. That family becomes the thing. Yeah. And I predict that once they run their gambit, they will grow those kids up really fast and have them form an identity, and either they'll taper off into another area on their own or just vanish completely, and they'll re-up things again.
I would imagine that at least what I would do, especially when it comes to Spider-Man, a character who typically has more than one title ongoing at a time, I would have one title where it's Spider-Man and family, and it's Spider-Man, but it's the Fantastic Four. It's the Spider-Man Fantastic Four. You know what I mean? They're a family of superheroes out on adventures. You give Mary Jane some kind of serum or something and give her a power, and you're off. But in the other books, he's still Spidey soloing up his adventures and stuff. As long as you always have that. It's the same thing that they do with Batman, where he has this huge family that they can incorporate in any combination that they want at any time, but they can also just choose in an issue, this is just a solo Batman story, and we're just going to pretend there's nobody else around, and it's just Batman on a solo story.
They
do that all
do.
the time.
They do that. But you know what separates the Fantastic Four from the other characters is they started out as that friendship and that family.
Yeah,
There was
that's
nothing
true.
before that. So there's
That's
nothing
true.
else to compare it to. Everybody
Ooh.
else has their adventures before, and then there's the adventures after.
So we're
And when there's
doomed with
change,
Spidey. Anytime he
yeah,
has a family, it's just not going to work out.
when you make change to a character, the audience rarely follows along with those changes. Some will and some won't, because how many years has Spider-Man been on his own?
I
And you have,
mean, but that's the thing is I always look at how many changes the character has gone through already, and I figure, well, like, what's the harm in more? Like, he's just gonna keep changing and reverting back anyway. So then, like, why not? Why not try these other stories that more niche audiences would like, and maybe just suck it up that they're not gonna sell as good, but people are gonna enjoy them. The ones who are looking out for them. I don't know. I would like them. I would
well,
like.
I think
I
the
always like those
reason,
weird Spider-Man stories that take place in weird parts of his life, right?
yeah, I mean, I saw the whole Mary Jane thing being a logical step, but then they played it off like, Mary Jane is doing her little job, or sometimes she's in danger, or he
Yeah.
has to kiss her goodbye before he goes out on his adventures. And is she going to worry about him? Before it was like, should I choose Gwen Stacy? Should I choose Mary Jane? There was that dichotomy
There
going
was
on.
conflict. There was a conflict there.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And where you remove the conflict, then you're lessening the struggles that the character can have. And when there's no struggles, then it just becomes, again, Superman putting on the costume, fighting the
Yeah.
bad guy, and
See, one of the interesting things that I think I learned from Robert Kirkman's Invincible is kind of what you're talking about, because the romance, the long running romance between Invincible and Adam Eve is a huge part of the story. But from the start, she has her own powers. From the start, she has her own story going on. And even once they become a couple, she still has her enemies out there. She still has storylines that are going to affect her. So she's not reliant on him to be interesting the way that Mary Jane is reliant on Peter Parker to be interesting.
they're also both superheroes, and they did have their own separate existences and
Exactly. Yeah.
villains, and
Yeah.
that was there in place from the start. It wasn't a change that they graduated to, like Invincible had a girlfriend and suddenly she got superpowers and they had
Yeah,
to
it
deal with
wasn't
all
like
that, you know.
It's true. It's true. It's true. It's such a like edge of the knife, kind of thing that we skirt when we're writing these stories. Where like just one step in the wrong direction, all of a sudden your whole story falls apart. It's so weird the way that happens.
You build an audience through all of the things that you've done with it up to that point. And I think a large part of going wrong with that is you need to sit down and figure out how the conflict is still going to be exacerbated once they cut off that thing between him and dating Mary Jane or Gwen and all that stuff that goes down. And what's the next level? Not so much you're settling him up, but this is the next level of his existence, and you're actually bringing more danger into his life because now with a family, he's more exposed.
Every run has its ups and downs, but what are some of your favorite like Spider-Man runs?
My favorite, of course, John Romita Jr. is hard to beat.
I love John Romita Jr. I love his Spider-Man. He was on the book when I became a Spider-Man reader. So he's my Spider-Man artist the way that Ditko is many people's Spider-Man artist. Like when I think of Spider-Man, I think of his Spider-Man.
And he's part of a tradition because his father was a very popular Spider-Man artist.
Yeah, of
When
course.
when I
first
when I first started going down to Marvel, he was running this little program called the Romita Raiders, where they would hire people at an hourly rate and bring them into like the bullpen. They offered me that job and I actually turned it down. I didn't want to go back and forth to the city, and I wanted to actually get my own comic book and not be part of a bullpen and running errands. And
man, but John Romita though, that would have been awesome to see your work with him. That would have been really cool.
I talked to him and he gave me critiques. It was him and remember Don Perlin from Valiant days. He was also up there working at Marvel at that time. And they gave me like my first real heartfelt Marvel critiques. I had other ones when I went down at an earlier point in life, and I remember meeting up with an editor who just tore my work apart. If he had something positive to say, it wasn't much. It got buried in the amount of critiques. He did not know how to critique. I left there and I didn't draw for like a month. But the thing is, after that, I went to a bookstore and I said, I've got to get better. I've got to beat this thing. And I bought all these art books on perspective and anatomy, and went outside of my comfort zone of comic books and expanded.
And his style is Romita Jr.'s is one that it's so easily recognized. It's so kind of weird and yet perfect at the same time, because his characters usually have very long limbs. They're very thin. They're very like sinewy. They're Spider-Man in particular, very fibery, his muscles, and just like a lot of lines, a lot of like scratchy lines, and I just love it. It just feels so raw and like just kind of like edgy.
He's sleek enough to do superheroes, but he's gritty enough that his style fits a variety of superheroes, and I think that's what made his career.
And shows different sides to a lot of superheroes. His Wolverine is so special to me. Like the way that he does Wolverine is unlike anybody else's Wolverine. There's a rage in his Wolverine that you just don't see in everyone's. It's very, very interesting, his style. I love his style. It's so good. Those harsh lines, those like really scratchy lines are so good. And
yet when he took over the X-Men book, I mean, it had a completely different feel. He had Dan Green inking him, and it was a really good combination, and yet I don't think it fit the X-Men as well as it could. It was still a very popular book, but
I always find that fascinating, though, the relationship between inker and penciler, and how the two could be a perfect marriage, or they could like clash very harshly. Like how do you have to work with the penciler other than just receiving his stuff and inking over it?
Can you have to work for the penciler, because you have to see their style and bring it out and sharpen it and still have enough of your own in there. Now with Dan Green, interesting story. Dan Green was an old timer. He was working in comic books back when I think EC days, and he would ink, and this is a quote from him, he inks more of what's on the page, a semblance of what's on the page, and not exactly what's on the page. And therein, I think he changed maybe Romita Jr.'s style up just enough that it was not quite his usual thing. And the guy that I worked with on the Ray, Howard Porter, he actually went on to a different miniseries called Underworld. I don't know if you remember that, where they had this big cast of DC villains, and
it does ring a bell.
Dan Green was the first inker that they hired for that, because they thought giving Howard a name inker would actually promote his superstar capabilities. And Dan Green did exactly what Dan Green does, and he inked what he thought was a semblance of what was on the page and not the actual artwork.
Yeah.
So Howard was showing me pencils that he would draw a car on next to the curb on the sidewalk, and after Dan inked it, the car wasn't there. He just drew a big bush.
Oh no.
And he's like, why am I bothering to draw it if you're not going to ink it?
So I get like moving like an arm slightly or something, but like just eliminating a whole piece of the drawing and doing a bush instead.
Don't get me wrong, Dan Green was a great inker, and he had like a very long run in comic books. But towards the end, especially when you're approaching the whole Image era, and people that were really wanting to preserve the pencils that they drew and have very dynamic looking art, and then an inker comes along and does something like that, I think
oh sure, yeah,
I think you kind of just dated yourself and put an expiration date on your career.
It's like, come on, man, like we're doing something else now.
My philosophy was always add to, but never take away from what's on the page.
That's probably a good way to go. What's like a really great collaboration with you that you're like really proud of, a piece of a graphic novel, a run, whatever, that you're just like, this is me? Where would you point people to?
I had various various styles, various things. Since I did work for the penciler and I worked for the company, I ended up getting caught up in the whole image style for a while, and it was a lot of fun. Scott Williams was one of my favorite inkers, but to do everything in that style is also a bit limiting. By the time I worked with Tom Lyle, I think I hit my peak, but Tom was a very strong penciler, and no matter what you did, you could accentuate what was there, but it was still basically, it was Tom's art. He was very cinematic, but his use of blacks and shadows and things that an inker might add to cause, create depth weren't always there. So people looked at my stuff over Tom, and even though I thought I was doing my best work, and Tom was a fantastic artist, they were like, I can't see you in here. And I'm like, why can't you see me? You've seen Tom with other inkers, obviously, but they weren't farsighted enough to see what we were doing as a team. And I think that was painful for both of us.
How much of that came out? How much of the those issues came to light? Were published?
Well, we worked on various SpiderMan projects, and without Tom, I would have never gotten to work on SpiderMan. We did The Punisher for a year, and there were other little things. We worked on a Star Wars project together, and I was with Tom for 5 years, and I have to say it was probably the happiest 5 years I spent in the comic industry, just because we got along so well. And he would say, if you got an idea, if you have an idea and you want to experiment, just go ahead and do it. And he allowed me to broaden my style, broaden my perspective, and I think that's what everybody needs is a permission slip to experiment. And like I said in the live stream, it's about experimenting with as many different techniques as you can, and you get better and better.
That's what it's all about, man. I love the collaborative nature of creative endeavors like this. Before I started working on my novel, on my work in progress, I was working on a graphic novel. It's been shelved for now. We'll get back to it after I'm a better writer. But I was basically running a writer's room with a couple of buddies of mine. We came up with the entire story for like a 3 graphic novel series. And it fell on me to eventually write the scripts. And I for what we want to do, I'm not a good enough writer yet to do it. So I had to set it aside and become a better writer first. But when we set out to do it, it's a graphic novel we're going to call Dusk. And the idea is to have a book that belongs on the shelf next to The Dark Knight, Watchmen, and The Sandman. You know what I mean? Like one of the greats. Like we're going for. So like that's why I was like, you know what? We have a great idea, but I'm not good enough to write the script yet. I'm gonna put that aside. Well, it'll give us a good 10 years to find a good artist. In the meantime, let me work on this other thing over here. Sometimes you got to do that, right?
Yeah, you do.
Sometimes you got to become a better writer so you can write that thing.
It all goes into who you are. So.
Indeed it does. Indeed it does. Robert, was there anything that you maybe wanted to get to in Livestream Sunday that you didn't?
I think we covered a lot. Could we expand on it?
We got through a lot.
Sure.
Yeah.
I think there's a lot about things that we talked about, AuthorTube and the trap that people shouldn't fall in. That's a pretty large subject and a big can of worms, because I don't like to point fingers or name names. It's just about, I think, the bigger tubers, the bigger people on the platform. I think that some of them, or maybe most of them, don't really have community availability or accessibility. And they do their thing and they don't get involved with that, but they don't realize that what they do as the bigger names on the platform, or the bigger numbers, is they set a precedent for everything else. And that's where a lot of the miscommunication comes from. They don't really...
They're focused on their own communities within their channel and not so much the rest of AuthorTube as a whole. I agree with that. Yeah. Especially
they don't really engage. They don't do the things that, I guess they're trying to emulate big famous writers, and we don't have time for that kind of thing. And
Sure.
no, sweetie, you need to make time for that.
Indeed. It's it's a good opportunity to shout out to Tim Hickson from Hello Future Me, who's going to be a guest on Livestream Sunday. He's on episode 9. I believe it's April 3rd. This is a gentleman with a huge following, a huge subscribership, 886,000. I think he may have gone up since the last time I checked. And I reached out to him about being a guest on my channel with my 230 subscribers. And I'm like, hey, mister, can you, do you mind? And he was really warm and receptive. And he's like, yeah, man, let's do it. And I got to respect the hell out of that because, he's got a larger audience than some of the people that we're talking about on AuthorTube.
Yes. And the better people that I have met all along the way feel that they need to give something back, because who is going to train the next generation of artists and writers? And you're leaving yourself open for this industry that you love to fall through the cracks, and that's exactly what's happening. And the bigger names that become more selfish, or arrogance, I should say, not so much bigger names, because there's bigger name people that are extremely nice.
Sure.
But the ones who are overly arrogant and don't give back, it's like any business or any venture. If you're not giving something back, that again is putting an expiration date on your career, because what are they going to judge you by? You have to be. It's like when I first got into the comic book industry, they told me something very important, and it's almost an unspoken rule. You have to be either very good at what you do, very nice, or very reliable. And within that triangle that was hanging on this editor's wall, it said, pick any two. You don't have to be all three, but you have to be at least two. So if you're a complete jerk, you still have to be very good at what you do or very reliable. And
both.
because we all know creators that are, not very nice, but we look at their work and say, wow, it's still exceptional. So in spite of, who they are, their work is still inspiring to me.
Yeah, that's another one of those things that's, really interesting to struggle with these days, with the whole cancel culture that's going on, and things come out about people, and then it's like, yeah, but what about this incredible thing that they did? Like, yeah, they're a horrible person, but look at how awesome this thing is. Like, we need to talk about this. It's interesting. It's a very fascinating side to society. Yeah, man. With this AuthorTube thing, I on one level I understand it. Where these bigger names, and neither one of us are naming names, but we all know who we're talking about. These bigger names who are very isolated in their own communities. I get it. I do. I get it. They've built something that is wholly their own, and they built it by themselves seemingly, and I get it.
Well, nobody does anything completely on your own. You're riding on the coattails of everyone who came before you. Yes.
That's why I said seemingly. Especially nowadays with the way that things are more and more accessible, and how a lot of us get our start on free platforms, things that okay, well, this thing will allow me to use it for free, so I'll just use that, and we just eventually get better and better as we go. They've built it all their own, and I get that, and I respect the hell out of it. I just wish that they would, like you say, kind of look around them and kind of give back to everyone around them. And I mean, because like you said, nobody's an island, man. Like, we all saw the same stuff on AuthorTube when we were coming up, and we all made our own decisions about what we were going to do instead, or what we were going to take from it, and
yeah,
you're gonna give back. You gotta give back, absolutely. And that's kind of, I bring that to the scheduling of Livestream Sunday in particular. I try very, very hard to balance between guests like yourself who have an audience that's larger than my own versus guests who have an audience that is smaller than my own, and I have both on the show, and I try to keep that balance, because I'm not gonna deny that I'm probably gonna get a little bit of a bump from your audience, but other folks are going to get a bump from my audience, and I'm just going to keep it going,
Yeah, and it's like I've said before, and I'll say it again. You have people like Lisa Daly, Michelle Schusterman. We all gather for our live streams every Wednesday. We have the same really great loyal group, but then you have AuthorTube on the whole. If I were in that position where I was just starting out and I had these people that were,
It's intimidating.
yeah, very much more experienced, and I'd have a lot of questions, and they just don't. And I can't understand that. Is your fear so great, or your arrogance so great that you can't break that bubble and say, hey, I need help with this? It's like you're admitting that I'm going to let the world see who I am, and I'm not the expert that I pretend to be. And I think that is why even the bigger tubers don't come around. Because I think there's a fear of being spotted or called out, but nobody's trying to call anybody out.
But it's that the fact that fear exists in them means that there's probably something that they're trying to
yeah,
sadly,
yes, that's really what it comes down to. That's my feeling as well.
Yeah, if their conscience was clear, they would come around. Which is why I've been following Tim Hicks and his channel for a long time. If he wanted to look me up in his subscribers, he would have to scroll for quite a while to find me. I've been following him for a very, very long time, and so it was so what's it called? Like it was a relief to know that you can reach out to folks with gigantic followings and they're still going to be receptive. It's not everybody, because I've reached out to a lot of people and most of them it's silence back, silence, dead air, and nothing. So like, just keep trying is what I say.
But if you don't reach out, or you don't ask, you don't get. And when I was growing up, I always looked, maybe because I was a creative person myself, that everybody that's out there is just another person. They persevered longer than some, and they've managed to break through. I mean, I've shared emails with people like Ed McBain / Evan Hunter, and people who are rock stars in Europe, simply because I had a question and said, hey, what about this? And they actually came back at me and we chatted for a while. Most of them are just people.
Yeah, all of them are. Yeah, they're all just people.
Well, maybe some of them aren't.
Lizard people? Are we talking lizard people now? Well, I saw the Queen in one video. Her eye got really weird. Fucking nut jobs out there. Mr. Jones, it has been such a great pleasure to talk to you, man. I can't wait to have you on again. I feel like there's so many more layers to peel back with you. I want to go ahead and call it a day, but thank you so very much for coming. If you have anything else that you want to say to everybody at home, give it to them right now. Go ahead.
Just keep plugging away. Just keep learning. It's a big universe out there, and take a look at everything within it and how you can apply it to your craft, because from nature to the book you passed up on the shelf all has a lesson for you if you observe it. As Sherlock Holmes would say, learn to observe the world, learn to see it. and that connotates experience.
On that note, I can't think of a better note. That's fantastic. Thank you very much, Mr. Jones. Thank you to everybody at home watching. Like, comment, subscribe. Give me 5 stars on Apple Podcasts. You know I deserve it. And come back on Sunday for Livestream Sunday with T.E. Butcher. Once again, thank you, Mr. Robert Jones. And right on, writers, we're out.